Hey guys, I'm super excited to bring to you Casey Adams, the 23-year-old phenom that has built more knowledge and experience in his lifetime than most people when they're in their 80s. So stay tuned for this incredible episode on the Founder Podcast. Yo, welcome to another episode of the Founder Podcast. Today, I am joined by Mr. Casey Adams. He is the host of the Casey Adams Show. Casey is a young hustler entrepreneur. I love this about him. 17 years old, he started his podcast. That was 6 years ago. Today, at the age of 23, has already experienced an exit, sold off a company about a year ago, and is currently building Listener FM, which is a software company, if I'm understanding this right, or a platform in the podcast space. Welcome to the show, Mr. Casey.
That's right, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. Quite the intro. I love the energy.
Dude, so tell us about this journey, man. 23 years old. Let's rewind to my journey at 23. Man, when I was 23 years old, I was just trying to figure out what business was. I was involved in sales. I was trying to think about, fantasize about opening up my first business. I opened my first business at the age of 24. You're freaking 23. You've been at this thing for 6 years. Dude, first of all, where did that entrepreneurial drive come from at the age of 17 to go and launch a podcast?
Yeah. So again, thank you so much for having me on the show today. And when it comes to my journey as an entrepreneur, it's one of those things that if you would have told me at 13, 14 years old that I'd be starting my first business at 16, I would have never believed you, because what led to me starting the podcast when I was 17 was actually a very traumatic experience that I went through at the age of 15. So I grew up in a small town in Virginia. I played sports all my life, played hockey for 10 years, played lacrosse. And then sophomore year of high school, I was playing football. And I ended up getting injured where it was the first day of hitting practice. I land on my neck wrong during one of these drills and go to the doctor the next day. And because I could barely move my head in any direction. And after getting x-rays, the doctor says, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is you're not paralyzed, but that could have been an outcome. So grateful that that's not the case. The bad news is you can never play football again, and you have to be in a neck brace for the next 6 months because your spine is very unstable. And, as a 15-year-old kid, it changed my entire life. And at the time, you could never connect the dots looking forward, only looking backwards, like the famous quote by Steve Jobs. But it was in that moment where I just became initially depressed and had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was angry and pissed off at the world. And as time went on, and with this newfound time that I have of just sitting in my room in a neck brace, I started just by accident going down these rabbit holes I shouldn't say by accident, but I started going down these rabbit holes on social media, following people like, Gary Vee and Tony Robbins and all these characters. And I've always had a passion and just a curiosity for business, but I don't come from an entrepreneurial background. My mom was a special ed teacher for the last 15 years and was a babysitter. My dad's worked at a tobacco company, Philip Morris, for the last 30 years. So this world of business and entrepreneurship was not in my house. But it was when I went down this rabbit hole that I came out on the other side of this injury, 16 years old, just fueled up with this newfound ambition for business and marketing and more so networking. And that's what initially led to starting the podcast, was this drive to go meet other successful people, learn from them, connect with them, and to hopefully, as a 17-year-old kid, create business opportunities through that.
It's interesting because as a teenager, to your point, like sports means so much to anybody that's an athlete, right? It is the defining moment of your life. And a lot of times, even as a 39-year-old, veteran entrepreneur, I'd call myself, I still draw upon experiences that I had in the sports world as a teenager, playing high school football, those type of things. And so I can only imagine the drasticness of this experience, because I had a similar experience. It wasn't an injury, but it was a very life defining moment in sports growing up when my coach, I was the backup quarterback as a sophomore, and as a junior I was, slotted to be the starting quarterback and everything. And then I ended up getting beat out by a sophomore
Mm,
for the starting position. And like, it wasn't because I wasn't capable. It wasn't because I wasn't talented enough. And I worked my butt off. I had done everything up until that moment to work for, and it was taken from me.
yeah.
And,
Wow.
and I felt that I had controlled everything I possibly could at that point. And so, like, injury takes that to a whole nother level from a standpoint. It was taken from you and you had no choice. And, and
Absolutely.
so like, yeah, like I can see why that was such a defining, because I look back at that moment so often in my life as like, I'm not going to allow somebody else to control my own destiny. It may not, if I have a goal to go and win a state championship or whatever it may be, go and put $1 billion in the bank,
Yeah.
the route may not be the route that I chose or thought was going to happen. And because different people are involved in it. And
Yeah.
so I, I love that was such a defining moment for you. So how does it go from, you study all these different people and you start like going down this rabbit hole of entrepreneurship, like you launch this podcast, and then eventually you started landing some big guests. Like what was it like initially out of the gate with this podcast? Did you immediately have success? Was it just slow compounding? How did that work?
Yeah, man. And real quick, even before going down there, like in terms of injuries, and appreciate you sharing that, right? Like over the years of having the podcast, which I'll get into in a second, just you realize that so many people, if not everyone that is successful, has had not only hardship, but a moment that defines the trajectory that they're unaware of at the time. And maybe it hasn't happened yet for them, and it's going to be that defining moment in the future. But for me, after that injury, being 16 years old, having no entrepreneurial background, when I started going down these rabbit holes of just soaking up information, how I landed on podcasting was I was reading Gary Vee's book, Crushing It, and the last chapter was just all about podcasting. And I think sometimes as either young entrepreneurs or just people overall, you start to ignore, like as you grow up, and I've felt this over the years, like what's right in front of you because you're so used to your like how you spend your time. And I remember just the last chapter of the book, you're about to wrap it up, and I'm just staring at this word podcasting. And I was someone that didn't listen to podcasts, wasn't too familiar with it. It was 2017. So looking back, like quite early in terms of like this podcasting wave that has occurred the past 6 years. And I remember just saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to start a podcast." There was no, overthinking. There was no like true strategy or plan. And I think that was one of the biggest blessings at the time. I remember going on my phone with a pair of wired Apple headphones and just walking in circles. The first episode, it's still out there. It's like 3.5 minutes long. I'm like, welcome to, it used to be called Rise the Young. Like, welcome to the Rise the Young podcast. The goal is to interview successful founders and entrepreneurs, and hopefully I learn something. And then, I'm figuring out, oh, like, how do I upload a podcast, do it within a day or two? And my podcast is live. And I say that, and before getting into all the guests and all the opportunities that have came from it, because so many people, especially today in 2023, this idea of starting a podcast, which I think is so valuable for so many different businesses and individuals, so many people just overthink it. And it takes them a year or 6 months even to conceptualize like how they could go about it. And granted, sometimes that might make sense. But for me at the time, and I think in a lot of cases, just getting started is the best thing to do. And how it quickly ramped up was I ended up getting a meeting with Gary Vee when I was 17, like a 5-minute thing in New York City, just from a cold DM on Instagram. Like, hey, Gary, just
Yes,
finished your book,
sir.
my
I love that.
podcast. Would love to, what does it take to get 5 minutes of your time? And he ended up getting back to me. And I remember I skipped like 3 days of school, go up to New York, meet him for a day. And excuse me, before I get there was like a 90-day period before I had this meeting with Gary. And I set a goal. I wanted to do 60 interviews in 90 days, which is a lot. And I just started being diligent about reaching out to people that I wanted to have on the show. Initially, friends of mine that I was just meeting that were similar to my age, and then starting to really shoot my shot with bigger names that I didn't think would ever reach out and get back to me. But it quickly became, this thing where I landed like Andy Frisella and Ed Milet and Grant Cardone. And there's lots of stories within all of those. But
It's awesome.
60 days later, I'm doing, 40, 50 interviews. I meet with Gary and I tell him, hey, I just interviewed all these people. And he gave me such confirmation of like, keep doing that. And you will be surprised about how much opportunity comes from just these micro occurrences as they compound. And just for context to the viewers, I've now had the show be 6 years in December, so a month from today. And I've done 450 interviews, from Larry King to Rick Ross to Elon Musk's mom and sister to the founders of Twitch and Netflix. And throughout all those opportunities, which we'll get into, like my last company, we raised a round of funding from 37 angel investors. And I always like to mention about 90% of those investors were previous guests on the podcast, right? So when I think about the long tail of not only creating content, but the compound effect of relationships, but intentional relationships, right? Like prior to today, we've never spent time on the phone. Now we're going to spend an hour and a half today here on the podcast, or an hour or so. You get to expedite relationship building, which I think creates trust, respect, and just more openness to opportunities to work together in the future. And I think that podcast has done that so well.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, man. The compound effect, like you're learning at a very young age how real the compound effect is, and just like that consistent effort over and over and over again. And I know you realize this, but that failure or that injury that took place, like that is just a precursor of things that will take place throughout your career. Because the reason why I drew upon me and my football experience so many times is because I went through similar type of experiences over and over in my career, where it's just like things outside of my control that were happening that, whether either I made a poor decision or whatever it may be that led to it, that I had to somehow figure out a different path, right? Somehow go and find that level of success. And life is funny, man. Like you get so many ups and downs, and people think that you're this great success when in reality you're just dealing with so much other crap that you got going on. But as that consistent behavior takes place, of whether it's reaching out to and doing 60 interviews in 90 days and doing that consistently, you said 500 shows or guests or whatnot, like that is the key: consistency and determination, regardless of whatever the result is. And so like how have you stayed strong? Because podcasting for 6 years, that takes a lot, right? Like that is I've been doing this podcast since June. I think we just hit 50 episodes or whatnot. We've had a lot of success, and it's had some incredible guests, but like it is exhausting. There is a lot of effort that goes into it. Like how have you stayed strong over the last 6 years in accomplishing that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love to just even the context of starting another show today. And I think is great context here. Like I'm in the process of launching a new show with 2 co-hosts that should be coming out in about a month. And even the thought process of starting a podcast is so different today than it was 6 years ago for me. Like I remember just when when it comes to, I don't even want to say competition, but just the amount of podcasts, how to think about the go to market, how to think about the content strategy, what makes it unique, and the opportunities that come within that. I think what's led to the consistency of the show is, number one, just it's hard to describe the feeling where I can say all these different names of people I've had on the show, but I can remember so vividly for a handful of guests where it's like that day and how I feel before and after, the minutes before, the minutes after an interview with someone like Rick Ross and leading up to that, like that feeling to me is so exhilarating. And it doesn't have to always be the most famous person, but just I might have someone on that they tell stories that impact me, and I just feel so great when I do it. So when it comes to the baggage that comes along with podcasting, it's one of those mediums that it's long form, so it takes a lot of time. And the reward of being able to having to package it up, create the clips, put it out there with, the discoverability isn't great always. Like it's a hard medium to master and to be consistent with, because there's people out there where you can just put out 10 TikToks and get tens of millions of views if you hit it right. And therefore, like what's more valuable for me? What I've always loved about podcasting is 3 things. One, the ability to meet people and actually network with people to expedite and build depth in relationships. Obviously, that could be looked at as a selfish thing, but I think it's the same thing on the flip side of with the audience. If I'm listening to this podcast, someone is going to be able to get to know me more just by listening to this one episode than if they, watched all of the short form content that I probably have out there in terms of
Right.
the depth, in terms of the knowledge. So the long tail of long form is so worth it. And that's in terms of meeting people. Secondly is learning from people. I think it's one of those things that we all have different ways of learning. Sometimes it's street smarts, it's book smarts, but I am such an avid believer in just the lifelong learner. I didn't go to college.
Yep.
A month after I graduated high school, I moved out to Arizona. I was running a media company. So just embracing this lifelong learner mentality, I think, I learn the most from stories and through others' experiences. And I think it's allowed me to cut my learning curve down and do the things that I've done at an early age by just asking questions and being curious and being willing to learn and to listen. And then lastly is the opportunities of the podcast. Every story that I tell in life, or I say, oh, we raised, 1.5 million for my last company, and 90% of the people came from being guests on the podcast. It's one of those things that as time has went on and as compounding has happened, I have seen firsthand how valuable the podcasts and interviews and the content has been, where I'm like, okay, if that's happened in those short 6 years, like I've always told myself this podcast is going to be something I do forever. And looking at, the greats in the space, the Joe Rogans or the people that have these massive audiences, to think like, okay, how do things compound in 20 years? Like that's what really gets me excited and allows me to just stay on top of it, and I will say, just a caveat, I've gone through times where I don't put out an episode for a month, for a month and a half, for 2 weeks. And I've never let that lack of momentum stop me from
That's great.
continuing. And I think you have to really ask yourself, like, why are you doing it? Because it's not that the podcast is something that, oh, like it's my only business and the only way I make money. It's the backbone of everything that creates so many opportunities and conversations and just, again, opportunities within the businesses that I operate in. And I know that this well. So that's what's led to me not only loving the medium, but staying consistent with it over the years.
For sure. For sure. Consistency and the compound effect are like just such incredible. It's been referred to as like the eighth wonder of the world, right? Is the compound, right? Compound interest. And when you look at it like for growth in podcasts, say you have 10 listeners and you compound by 10%, right? You go from 10 to 11 listeners, not anything exciting. And the reality is what I've seen in the social media platforms or podcasts is you really can compound about 10% a month. And so, going from 10 to 11, not exciting. Going from 100 to 110, okay. Going from 10,000 to 11,000, better. Going from 1 million to 1.1 million, best, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and it's really just the same level of compounding happening over and over again. But the only way that you ever get that 100,000 growth there of the million to 1.1 million is you have to start, right? You have to be consistent when you're going from 10 to 11, 11 to 12, 12 to 13, and so on and so forth. And I think that's the hardest. And the fact that you've gotten through that, right? Like you've done it for 6 years. You've had these incredible guests. You've had these incredible experiences. You've seen ROI on the podcast with fundraising and ideas and building businesses. And now you're building within the space from with the listener.fm. Like that's just phenomenal. So tell us a little bit more about Listener FM. Like what kind of software is? I don't know any of the background there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Listener FM it's a company that I launched about 4 months ago. And just for the context, so my last company, MediaKits.com, that's a business that was the easiest way for creators to aggregate all of their cross-platform data in one place to then easily share with a brand, and it updates in real time. So we launched that back in 2020. The business, we got acquired in 2022, last September. So I worked at the acquiring company for 6 months, and now bringing us to today, the last 4 to 6 months coming out of working at the company Viral Nation, has just been really thinking about not only what problems am I dealing with, but what do I want to go spend my time? And, one thing for me that has always been so consistent has been this podcast. And I've obviously have learned a lot. I've experienced all the different platforms and the pain points and the struggling elements of maintaining a show. And the one thing that just kept coming up in my mind is just all things post-production, right? Like we're talking about what does it take to run a podcast, all the things that go within it. It's not just a short form video, you put it out. So what Listener FM is the easiest way for podcasters to manage the post-production workflow using AI, where our simple product that we started with is just the ability to take an audio file, video file, upload it to our platform, and it will create ready to use SEO optimized titles, descriptions, show notes, blog posts, newsletters, all of the text-based written content for podcasters. And, that's just scratching the
Amazing.
surface of where we are going and how we view it. But as someone that's been in the space for a while, I more so built something that now I use every single time I do a podcast, which is very frequently. And we're just building on top of that. And I think as someone that's so in the space, to think about, how can I create what I like to call a vertically integrated podcast network with, own IP and different unique shows, bringing in the network to provide service to podcasters and a lot of companies that are moving into the space. I think it's, a very, I don't want to say early inning because podcasting has been around for a while, but how the medium is shifting and evolving to a more trusted and respected and prominent medium. You look at all the short form content on social media and it's a lot of times just podcast clips, right? And those are the most viral moments, the conversations, the interactions with two different people. So that's what Listener FM is. And again, I just love all things podcasting. And I ask myself as a founder, like, what am I dealing with? What is something that's just simple? And I think that was also what led to the success of Media Kits. We started by asking ourselves, like, what are problems that creators deal with? And one of my best friends, Jeff, he's this big automotive YouTuber that had about 1 million subscribers at the time. And he was coming to myself and my co-founder and saying, hey guys, like, this brand wants a media kit from me. I got to organize all my data. Like, how do I do this? I have screenshots of my Instagram and my TikTok and my YouTube. And there was no way to just easily aggregate all of your data that stays updated in real time. And it was just a problem that, again, we were dealing with, that we saw through a friend. And we just started with the first step. And I think that has really been my approach to everything of starting a podcast is just, okay, I'm just going to take the first step and, record an episode. Oh, like, you need a media kit. Let's build one on Canva and understand like what the pain points are. And now that obviously the same question has led to media, listeners.
I love that. The fact that you're focusing on the just real problems, right? Like that is where great innovation ideas come from, is when you understand like, hey, put myself in their shoes and all right, what issues do I deal with? For your first business, now for your second business, these ideas are coming from pain points that your friends or whatnot that are launching in the podcast space, like, and really just, sticking in the space that you really know and understand and can become innovative from. I love that. So you spoke about being a lifelong learner. Like, what are some best practices that you have as far as like education outside of the podcast? Because obviously when you get on with guests that have incredible experience, you're learning, you're growing. That's a phenomenal. I've learned that myself in hosting a podcast. Like, there's so many experiences that I could draw on, and this is like literally being at the best college ever, right? and learning from real experiences. What are some additional resources or best practices that you utilize to improve your education?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'd be so curious to reverse it and hear from you as well. And we'll do that another time on my show for sure. But, for me, as someone that, again, and I want to reference this again, just, I didn't go to college, and what is a lifelong learner? And I think that's someone that's willing to learn anything from anybody, good or bad, right? Where for me, and hence why I even called my company Listener FM. Like, this idea of being a listener, I think is just the bedrock of how I view the world. Where, in a relationship, like, I just got engaged this July. I've been in a relationship for the last 3 years. And I think from relationships to business relationships, to co-founder dynamics, thank you. It's just, how can you listen to the other person's perspective, but also just have the willingness to not just talk and let your thoughts out, but to soak in knowledge. And I remember, when I was 17, 18, and we have some mutual friends like Dan Fleischman. He was always doing these networking events. I was always there. And it's not like when I was 18 or 17, I had too much to provide besides like a youthful spirit and a hardworking, ambitious mindset. But just being in rooms and again, listening has been so valuable to not only education, but it's just scratching the surface. And when I interviewed Larry King back in 2019, and just that was an interview for me. I was 19 years old. He was 87 years old. And thinking about all of the interviews that he's done over the years, I think it was like 50,000. He had a quote that stuck with me. It's a famous quote by him. But when I was talking to him, he says, I've never learned anything while I was talking, and just to embrace this idea of being a listener. And that really stuck with me, and it's carried into not only embracing it in terms of my learning approach, but naming the company and all the things that I'm doing today. But outside of that, I think it's as you know, just surrounding yourself with people that have done it before, that have experienced what you want to experience. And this could mean, for example, last year I ran my first marathon in
So
Hawaii,
cool.
and prior to running my first marathon, I like 6 months before that, or maybe 12 months before that, the longest I've ever ran was 3 miles. And it was just sort of these things where I started interviewing through the podcast people that have done these ultra marathons, or James Lawrence, the Iron Cowboy, that's done
Right.
101 Ironmans back to
Wild.
back, which is just mind
It's
bending.
craziest story. Right.
Yeah. So just putting myself in a position to not think, oh, I have to go figure it out by myself, but how can you, put yourself in a place to learn from people that have been there before, whether that's through listening to a podcast, through reading a book, or by just simply, doing the research to think 5, 10 steps ahead, right? I think nowadays in this world of the abundance of content, it's easier than ever to learn things, but you also have differing of opinions and lack of quality a lot of times. So it's
Right.
also, I think, a superpower is learning to identify who you want to learn from, and really having a guard there, because especially like all things health and nutrition, there's so many contradicting opinions. And I think that's a great
Yeah.
example of like who to learn from. There is no one size fits all. And I think that's very a blanket statement across everything of like, what's the best business advice? You could ask 100 different entrepreneurs, and it's probably a little
All
bit
different.
different, and you can't take everything with just like one size fits all. And I think that's a lesson that I've learned through all the interviews as well, in terms of, again, to your question, like my learning approach is just be curious, but put yourself in a position where you can take in different information, and just be around people that have been there before.
So I love the focus of listening, but along with that, I think in order to listen, a lot of times you have to ask the questions. And early in my career, it was hard for me to ask questions. It was difficult for me to be around people that knew more than me, and me not trying to act like I had it all figured out. Right. That was one of the mistakes that I made as a young entrepreneur. I wanted to know the answers without going and seeking them, or without showing weakness of not knowing. All right. Not and that hurt me a lot early in my career. I ended up filing bankruptcy and losing everything and whatnot.
Well,
And it was really because I was unwilling to ask the question, and because I didn't ask the question, I wasn't put in a position to listen and to
yeah,
learn. And
that's
so,
powerful.
like, what this podcast is teaching you at such a young age is like wise way beyond your years. Like, most people don't figure this out until their 40s or 50s, that hey, I got to ask the questions, and I got to be willing to listen. I got to be willing to listen to the answers, because there are so many people, everybody that has gone through life, they have something to teach, right? Regardless of what their experience is, there is something that is unique to them that they can teach you. And, that's one of the things that I've learned through podcasting or running businesses or whatnot, is like every perspective is amazing, and there's opportunity to learn from all. And so I appreciate the fact that at the age of 23, you're getting this stuff figured out.
I appreciate that, and you hit it right on the nail as well. Just asking the right questions, and it's funny because we were talking before this about all things just like domains, and I've had the domain on Instagram at questions for a while, and it's actually a funny story that I think just there's a lot that we could speak about within it. But I got this domain at questions, and one of my good friends Jordan Young. He goes by the name DJ Swivel. He's a Grammy winning producer and musician. One day I posted that hey, I just got at questions. I had no clue what I wanted to do with it, but I was just someone that's like been in the podcasting world. I've asked more questions to different people over the years. And I'm like, great, I got this handle. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. And I posted that I had it, and my friend Jordan calls me up. And it'll all make sense and come full circle. He calls me up. He's like, dude, are you serious right now? You have at questions, and this is insane. So I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, okay, last night I was at dinner with a good friend of mine, Brandon Jenner, who is like stepbrother, half brother, Kylie, Kendall, and that whole family.
Right.
I was at dinner with Brandon, and we were just joking, like, oh, let's start a podcast. Oh, like, well, what would we call it? Questions. And then Brandon's wife was like, oh my God, like Brandon used to be called Questions growing up. Like that would be hilarious. And then dinner ends and they just move on, and they probably would have never thought about starting it. And then the following morning is when Jordan sees my story, and I'm like his friend that's had this podcast for the longest time. And I post at questions, and we just start brainstorming of like, oh my God, like, what are you going to do with that? And we're like, oh, what if we started a podcast together? And then we just got on this rabbit hole. And long story short, now we're 8 to 10 episodes in, and the podcast is called Questions. And it's exactly to your point, Chris, of what you just said, of just, we all come from extremely different backgrounds. We all have different people in our network. And, the biggest thing that we could all do is just bring on interesting people and ask unique questions coming from different walks of life, having different perspectives, like a conversation that you have with someone. Let's say we both interviewed Larry King. The questions you would ask and the questions I would ask would dictate the entire conversation and where it goes. And I'm so happy that you said that, because I think if you're someone that doesn't really make a focused intention to ask, I don't want to say the right questions, but just quality questions with, just your best foot forward, you're not putting yourself in the best place to be a better listener, right? So I just wanted to go full circle there and share that story, because I think it's so important to obviously ask the right questions to be able to be a better listener.
It's awesome. It's awesome. So, Casey, so you recently got engaged. Congratulations. You said, what's her name?
Jacqueline.
Jacqueline. Congratulations. So at the age of 23, most of the world isn't looking at getting engaged, right? Like, I'm a family man. I got married at the age of 21. I have 5 kids.
Wow.
And so heavy focus on the family for me. But the trends that I've seen is like more and more people are going away from traditional marriage or, building a family. They choose to, have dogs and careers and, all these different things. Why, for you, is it a focus to be engaged and to move forward in creating a family unit?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful you asked that, and it's super inspiring from your perspective too. Married at 21, that's awesome. If it's one of those things, like looking back on these last 6 years, if you would have told me like, hey, you'd be engaged at 23 when I was 18, like literally I wouldn't have believed it, right? And I remember, so just for context, Jacqueline and we were dating for a little over 3 years. We got engaged this July. And, looking back on when we started dating, I'll mention this, and sometimes she hates it. So I was 19 years old. She was 26. So there's an age gap, and it's something that is unique. And it's like, but I embrace that. And it's something that I think a lot of people can learn from, is like who I was then and the maturity and how I viewed the world. Like I graduated high school when I was 17, moved across the country to Arizona, running a media company. And I just always did things sort of like earlier in my life, right? Like I was this youngest brother. I have 2 older brothers. They were still living at home. I moved across the country, and I was learning so much. So like thinking back on it, it's not that I was seeking a relationship, or I wanted to go get engaged young, get married young, but it felt so right. And I think this idea of commitment, like committing to the podcast, and just when I started it, I knew like this deep conviction that like, I'm going to do this. This isn't something that I'm just starting and I'll move on to the next thing. Like that same level of conviction and depth of commitment was very apparent to me from the start. And I think, again, to like our last point, just asking those questions of, do I want to go on this journey? Is this something that, this idea of planting a seed and growing together was very not only exciting to me, but I value that. And it's funny how we met. David Meltzer, are you familiar with David? Or
Yeah.
David?
Yeah.
So that's Jacqueline's cousin. So how we initially sort of met was Dave was a mentor of mine from afar. Like I followed his content on social. I started going to some events, and he was
Right.
there, and we met and had him on the podcast. And Jacqueline was initially working for David Meltzer, and then was working as the executive assistant to Dan Fleischman. So we were just sort of in these same circles as I was like really getting immersed in this whole world of business and entrepreneurship. And it just was one of those things, again, not to just speak on being engaged for so long, but we were best friends for about a year and a half before we started dating. And
Yeah.
we just had a lot of substance that led to the decision to then start dating and now being engaged. And quite frankly, as a young man, it's been the best thing that's ever like happened to me. Right. And I don't have the
So cool.
context to, like to draw back on like, oh, past relationships and all these different things. But I ask myself a lot, like, oh, like, what do I think led to this commitment? And, like, oh, wow, like my parents have been happily married for 31 years. Oh, got it. Oh, my grandparents, oh, they've been married for 54,
Right.
55 years. So just, I've analyzed that over the years, and I'm like, okay, this is all I know in terms of just commitment, right? For
Right.
without kind of drawing the whole bigger picture there. So again, it's something that I'm excited about. I think it is the foundation of how I view business, and to have a partner that is so
Right.
strong and supportive is just, again, one of the best things that's ever happened to me.
Well, and I think, I mean, you didn't bring this up, but I would assume with all the different interviews and the different people that you've interviewed and met and all the different things, you've seen all the different angles of relationships, of family, right? And you've seen those that have had successful relationships and those that haven't, and what it took. You bring up the example of your parents, your grandparents, and everything else. And I'm a big believer that many of the issues that we have today in our society are due to the deterioration of the family, of the lack of commitment, of these things where there's just no faithfulness anymore towards people and each other. And so, like, for me, like, if I want to change society, if I want to change the world, I got to start by changing my family and being that example. And so I think it's cool that you're realizing this, like I said, at a young age, and you're doing things that are contrary to the rest of the world, contrary to the deterioration that's happening out there. So I applaud you.
I appreciate it.
Dude. So dude, you got the rest of your life ahead of you. What are some goals? What are some things that you are chasing? Obviously, this listener thing is going to be awesome, and you're gonna rock it, and you're gonna make millions of dollars. It's gonna be phenomenal. What are some other things that drive you outside of making millions through listener and running marathons in Hawaii?
I love it. It's when I think about life, I think it's been a unique thought process the last 6 years, right? Where I'm 23 and I feel like I've lived like 5 lives in terms of like different locations with different friends, different businesses, and now being engaged, where it's just the constant battle of like life is long, but life is short, right? Like Jesse Itzler, who I love his content. I've had him on the podcast a while, and this is something that I haven't thought about a lot, but it just came to mind where he sent me, his team sent me this calendar that he has. It's called the Big Ass Calendar, and it's like your entire year that you can put.
I get an ad. I get ads on Instagram for that thing, and I've thought about buying it 3 or 4 times, and then I always forget.
So I just got one about a week ago, and I was putting things on it for next year. And I think to your question of like what excites me, right? I think this idea of kind of what Jesse talked about is, again, life is long, but life is short, right? If I'm 23 years old and if I want to have like 50 strong years, granted, I want to live to over 100 years old, but this idea of really mapping out like like how can you create year defining moments, right? Whether that's writing a book, starting a new company, having an exit, going on a trip that you've always wanted to do, doing something with a group of friends. I think I've never been more aligned with just the pillars in my life of, the podcast and zoning in on all things listener to really build not only the podcast but services in the podcasting space, this whole vertically integrated podcast network that I've been working on and excited to really launch into later this year in 2024. So it's the business element, it's the foundational relationship element, but also the health element. Like I'm someone that, again, I'm training for a marathon right now. It's in about 25 days in Palm Beach, Florida. And running for me, like I think running culture is so interesting because if someone's not in it, it's like, why are people running marathons? And for me, it's the mental aspect that comes from whether that's running or some people that might be lifting, for some people that might be walking, right? It doesn't matter to what extent that it is. It's just having that outlet of health has never been more important to me. And I think that zoning in on how you can prioritize that as not only a young age, at any age, granted, but filling these buckets up and really making a wholesome life is very important to me. And by no means, and you talked about this earlier, I don't have it all figured out. I'm putting brick by brick every single day. And outside of that, and the fourth thing is just quality relationships, right? I think in this world where, the quote by Warren Buffett, right? Like reputation takes 20 years to build, but 2 seconds to ruin, right? Like this idea of embracing longevity in every area of life, of being engaged young, starting a podcast and doing that forever, and like building businesses, like health and making that a part of your life, but also quality relationships that fuel, your purpose of doing things, from traveling to events to dinners. I think those four buckets are just very apparent to me of, what makes a successful life. And, by no means was this my original thinking. I think it's one of those things where over the 400, 500 interviews, you get to really experience like some people, they have it all, you would think, but then you hear them share their stories and it always comes back to just, they could have all the money in the world, but bad relationships or no health, and this ability to really, identify what's important to make it all exciting and fulfill it, I think is something that I'm excited about, just to keep pursuing, to keep getting better every day.
Once again, wise among beyond your years. Clearly, you've been paying attention to the guests that you've interviewed, because these things that you've figured out at a young age, like fitness, right? Like I was a big fitness guy in high school, but then after sports, it was like, why bother? And and it wasn't until the age of, what was in 2015, age of 31, that I like finally was like, oh, I really only get one shot at this body. I better get this thing back into shape. And like at that point I was, 30, 40 pounds overweight and all these different things. And it wasn't until like I started focusing on it, and it's been a big focus of mine for the last 8 years, but it took me many years to figure that out. The fact that like you understand this at a younger age, like phenomenal. And I think society is starting to push more towards that, which is great. Just a focus on like the way that we experience life is through the physical body. And and it's funny because I'm just like a big thick guy, and I'm not fat, but I was made to hit things and tackle things, and right, I'm not naturally skinny, and I'm not naturally a runner. And you speak about like the running culture and all these things, and I'm like trying to train my mind like I am a runner. I think right. It's funny because right now we're in our community. One of our challenges that we're doing is a 5K every day for the month of November.
Wow,
And so
that's epic.
So I push that, but I like, this is me pushing it, and I'm just like, I am not a runner, but then I got to remind myself I'm a runner.
Yeah,
Like, and I'm out there and my knees are hurting, and like I've got like knee braces on to like, because I just like carry so much, I carry more muscle than, I need to lose probably. And so, but man, I'm just like jealous. I'm like, dude, I wish I would have embraced the running culture at age of 23, and like, because like these are regrets that I have, right? That I wish I would have just spent less time in the weight room and more time on the running path, and all these things. But man, you got a lot of things figured out. I love that drives you. That's the fitness, the relationships, the being free. Like there's so much more to money. And do you know who Naval is?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So one of my favorite quotes from Naval is the best thing that can ever happen to you is that you get rich as fast as possible, for then you'll realize that that's what life is not about. And so it's sad that so much of our society is built around finances and this chase for the ever dollar. And don't get me wrong, I love money, I love creating value.
Yeah.
Money is simply a derivative of creating value, but people put so much focus on it and they lose sight of everything else: their relationships, their fitness, their relationship with God, or whatever it may be. And they're just chasing this
Yeah.
thing. And then, finally, maybe they achieve it in their 60s or their 70s, only to realize that, man, this is just an empty promise that I've been given my whole life. Right. Like, and so that quote always inspires me, right? That is just like, I'm so glad and blessed that I got rich at a young age, because it allows me to focus on the real purposes of life. And the fact that you're learning that at a young dude, once again,
Yeah.
applaud you.
Thank you, man. I've never met Naval, but I've interviewed his brother Kamal Ravikant, who's now been turned into a good friend, and he has a book, Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. And I think these are a lot of things, right? Like, especially like being embraced in these, not only quotes, but just the way humans live. And Naval's a very smart guy, so is Kamal. But just to be around his energy and to understand, like, got it, like how they live, how they show up, and being in the presence of people that, again, like some people would say, have it all. You quickly, I feel, that learn like what's really important. And I love the shared, not only understanding there, but that quote is beyond powerful. And I think just embracing that as early as possible is really important. And also too, like something that it just has been on my mind a lot the past week, and I won't go too much into the details, but someone I know that I had the opportunity to work with committed suicide about a week ago, and just I was on a run. I remember I was like 10 miles into a run, and I get this text, and it just, everything else becomes simply irrelevant, right? Like you get these reminders in life of, whether that's through moments of loss or tragedy or injuries, but this moment in particular, it's just like a bus hits you, and we all have these goals and aspirations, and we're driven to, whether that's in a financial way or in a family way. And something that you said earlier in this podcast that I always have like a special thought around. You said, you're 23, you have all the time in the world in front of you. I remember being 15 years old, going to this event in Richmond, Virginia, where I'm from. It was like a real estate conference, and I just ended up going. I had no clue what I was getting myself into. And the speaker on stage went around the room, and he asked a question. He says, who thinks they're the youngest person in this room? And they always like probably like mid 30-year-olds are like, oh, me, like this, because it was like kind of an older crowd. And I'm in like the front row. I'm 15 at the time. I'm by far the youngest person in this room, I would assume. So my hand's going up. It's super strong. And everyone, he's like, oh, if you're younger than 30, if you're older than 30, put your hand down. And it's going 18, 16, 15. Last one standing, that's me. He has me stand up, and he goes on to say, just, we could all have these goals, acquire X units of real estate. And you could say, oh, he's 15, has the whole world in front of you. But the reality is, like, another day is not guaranteed. And just to fully understand that, and bringing you back to, something that I found out recently from a friend, it's so easy to forget that, right? This idea of like deferring your own mortality. An interview that I love is someone that is, again, now a friend, Robert Greene, 48 Laws of Power. He has just this whole idea of embracing your mortality and like really thinking through of like death. And some people might think it's morbid, but I think about death probably every day in like a very
Yeah.
powerful way. Um, and I think too, just not to go on too much of a tangent, I just think that it's something that we would all maybe treat others better. We would have less, like envy or, just these negative emotions that can bring out negative parts of a human, and have more empathy for people and what they're going through, because you never know what people are dealing with. And I think if someone's listening and they've made it this far in the podcast, I just want it to be a reminder to just check in on your people. Like it's so easy
Right.
to be like, I don't want to say surface level, but just like, I'm a very positive person all the time. I try to lift others up, but just to get real and to ask people like, how are you dealing? Like, what are you dealing with? And like, how can we work through it? Because it's hard to fully get a grasp on how people feel unless you give them that opportunity to share.
Amen. And one of my favorite best practices that I try to use in my life is I ask myself, would I be okay with the way I'm treating this person if they were to die tomorrow? Right.
Mm,
Or would I be okay if I were to die tomorrow, if this is how they remembered me? Right. And so that always puts life into perspective really quick and changes my behavior in the moment. And it also changes the way that I take advantage of every single day. I think it's very powerful, like your recommendation to actually ponder on your mortality, because there is nothing like, we are driven by fear. Fear is one of the main drivers in our life. And the greatest fear that each one of us have is to die. And so, you put a gun to somebody's head and ask and make a request, they're complying, right? Because the fear of death is so great. And so if you can somehow manipulate that
yeah.
fear of death or whatnot, and use it for a positive force in your actions, the way you treat people or whatnot, like that's where life really starts becoming powerful.
Amen.
So
Absolutely.
anyways, Casey, dude, I appreciate you taking the time. I know your time is valuable. Before we part ways, obviously you've spent a lot of time reading, writing, developing. You got quotes right from the tip of your mind. What are some of your top educational sources, maybe masterminds or mentors or books that you could recommend to the audience for those that have listened thus far?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to come on today. I've had the best time. And there's a book that I I always go back to, and it's simply How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Amen.
Because the way I live, and sometimes I try to read that book once a year just to go back and like refresh on the concepts. And every time I go back to it, I'm like, wow, like this book really like bled into me. It's just subconsciously, just the simple things
Timeless.
that are in that book of like, whether that's remembering someone's name and it's the best sound in someone's brain is their own name. But that book has just been foundational. I think that's one in terms of book. I think secondly, in the world of all things podcasting, personally, again, I love the medium, and I have lots of podcasts that I listen to. One that I love from just all things business in the world, and the perspectives are very unique, are the All In podcast. So that's one that if you haven't checked it out, obviously do. And if you're someone that's listened to podcasts, you've probably heard it before. But outside of just that podcast, I think just finding a podcast or one, two, three of them that you listen to is so good to add to your day. Whether you listen for 15 minutes when you're like doing the dishes, or you're in the car or in the Uber or on a walk. I think this idea of just finding consistent podcasts where you want to learn something new, or hear perspectives of others, is something that I would always recommend people to add into their routines. And then lastly is just find something that makes you feel inspired. For me, I think that's journaling. I try to every day, but just things that make you feel inspired. That could be seeing the sunrise, seeing the sunset, journaling, or things that just make you feel good, outside of going to the gym and, spending time with quality people. Like, what is just something that you should add to your life that can, again, make you feel inspired? And, that's not necessarily something that's learning related, but I think it coincides a lot with just how I, what I want to leave the conversation with.
Absolutely love that. Awesome, Casey. Appreciate that advice and your time. Where can my listeners get in contact with you, follow you? What's your Instagram handle? What's the best spot to find you?
Yeah. So best place. My Instagram is just at Casey, Casey. Super simple there. And then the podcast
Nice.
is the Casey Adams Show. And then for everything, all the projects I'm working on, if you want to email me, it's just caseyadams.com. You can get in touch with me there. And outside of that, looking forward to connecting with all the listeners. And once again, Chris, thank you so much for the incredible opportunity. This is something very special, and I'm very grateful for you today.
Yeah, thank you for your time. Until next
Woo!
time.